Welcome to Unit 7 for Bio 230 students in Anatomy and Physiology 1 course. Today we're going to be talking about bones as part of the human skeleton. Now, osteology is the study of bones. There are 3 chapters in the book that we're going to cover that deal with bones, 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7 will be talking about the histology, the basics of the bone, like we're doing today. Chapter 8, or Unit 8 rather, will be dealing with just naming all the bones in the body, and 9 will be a short chapter just explaining some of the what's called articulations or joints. Now for the Unit 7, what we need to cover is essentially talking about histologically under microscope what kind of things you will see when you look at bone, and also general structure of the bone when you see the skeleton, you're holding a bone in your hands, or in this case looking at the pictures and kind of trying to see what kind of special features, what kind of names we give to different components. Now if you had a living bone in front of you in your hands, you would see that it's first covered by what's called periosteum. This is the thin membrane with blood vessels and nerves that provides the nutrients and support, and again covers the bone like a capsule. Now when you remove the periosteum, which could be peeled off, then you see the bone itself, and this one, it consists of what's called cortical bone. Cortical means cortex, right? That's also the outer shell. It's also sometimes called a compact bone, and this is the hard rigid bone that we all know. And so again, under the periosteum is the cortical bone, the true bone itself. When you dig deeper beyond the cortical bone, you find that there's a softer bone called the spongy bone, also called cancellous. And this is the material essentially the deep inside the bone, not there to provide structural support physically to the skeleton or to the bones, but there to house actually the bone marrow that's going to be deep inside. Keep in mind, bone marrow, essentially, this is the component that we're going to talk about soon. That's going to be very important for blood cell formation, other functions. Again, so when you're looking at the bone, you have, right, so this is in a typical fashion like this. If this was, imagine, a living bone, the outer portion would be the periosteum. Once you remove the periosteum, you see the cortical bone, and then spongy bone inside. Now, when you look at the bones under a microscope, you're going to see that they consist of what's called osteons. Osteons are the functional units or the main key components of the bones, and essentially what they're doing there is that because bones are, remember, connective tissue, they don't have that many cells. What they do have is essentially rings and rings of calcium, collagen, other compounds, all kind of mineralized together, all combined in these concentric solidified forms. Kind of like rings in a tree. If you cut down a tree and see those growth rings, in sort of similar fashion like this, to provide the rigidity and stability to the bone. Now, so the osteon consists of lamella, haversian canals, Volkmann's canals, and lacunae. So when you're looking at this diagram, or obviously in the book, when you see these rings, the center is always going to be dark. The rings are the lamella. Basically, under microscope, this is what they're about going to look like. Chemically, if you were to identify them, they're essentially calcium and collagen combined together, and this framework to provide stability and strength to the bone. And then every once in a while, you see this darkening. These spots are the lacunae. These are actually spaces for the bone cells or osteocytes to reside in. Again, remember, bone is solid, so the cells cannot just move anywhere they want. They need to be located in specific sort of units or like little spaces, and lacunae are the spaces for these living cells, for the osteocytes. And the rest, we have to keep in mind that the bone needs nutrients, right? Bone is a living tissue, living organ, just like a stomach or skin or any other organ. And so it does need blood vessels, it needs nutritional supply, it needs supply of from the nervous system, the nerves, the messages, and the same signaling. And so we have these either central or perforating canals, haversian canals, and Volkmann's canals, named according to the scientists who discovered them. Basically what they are, right, so like if you're looking at this section going in, this would be central canal, the haversian canal, and one coming at an angle like this would be the perforating canal. Again, these are carrying blood vessels and nerves so the nutrients and everything necessary for the living bone to survive. Okay, under a microscope you can also see them, not necessarily see the blood vessels, but see that something is there. And again, it reminds us that bones are living tissue and are very important not to forget, just like with any other organ, they need a blood supply, they need to receive nerves and all the same information, just like, and resources just like any other organ. Okay, so that's the osteon. Again, there's going to be multiple osteons when you see them on the slide or in images. Each one, even under relatively low magnification, you can see this general picture. Again, keep in mind, right, we can't see the actual molecules like collagen or calcium, right, because they're too small, but based on regular staining methods for the bone, we will see the osteons and see this general kind of specimen like that. Now, another thing to keep in mind is there's other ways to talk about the bone, is to say that, well, when you have a bone in front of you, you see that the skeleton consists of bones of different shapes, different sizes. The way we classify the bone shapes is basically according to the general appearance, as in what is the greatest, most important feature of that bone. So, for instance, taking, let's say, this bone, let's say this was a bone from your leg, which is like the femur. This would be a long bone, right? The femur, the bone that goes from the hip down to the knee. When you see it, what is its main feature? It's length, right? It's a long bone. Same thing for bones in your arms and other bones in your legs, right? Like the tibia, the humerus, radius, ulna, these bones. But also little bones in your fingers, again, they're also considered long bones because length is their main feature. Again, it's not about taking a tape measure and comparing how long the bone is. It's about saying that when I look at them side by side, its length stands out as the main feature. That's how we classify these shapes. Again, I know it's a little bit confusing sometimes, but essentially, when you'll see them in the book or see them in the lab, they are essentially named according to their main feature. Again, in this case, it's length. Now, if it's a short bone, there's just a few short bones. Carpals is the best example, right? These are bones in the wrist, right? You remember carpal means wrist. So these bones kind of like have square-like sort of appearance. We call them short bones. Flat bones, right, like the collarbones or the clavicle or ribs, right, have that flatness to them, so we call them flat. Some other bones, like in the skull or in the pelvis, also could be called flat. So essentially, right, just kind of based on the appearance, right, it's not to kind of confuse this. It's not a matter of trying to investigate too deeply what this is. This is essentially just kind of calling it how it is descriptively, by description. And then irregular shape of the bone is usually referred to like the vertebra, which are the bones protecting the spinal cord, part of the spine. Those bones, as you see them, they kind of have a sort of this is a miscellaneous category of irregular. There are different processes, different parts sticking out of it. It's not really flat, it's not long, it's not short, right? So irregular is the shape of those bones. Again, vertebra is the best example that I'm providing you here. Make sure to know at least one example for each of these, just like indicated here. Now, when you're looking at a typical bone like this, you're going to say that, well, most of the bone, the shaft of the bone, right, that's the diaphysis of the bone, and on each end where we have a joint, where the bone will join with another bone, making some kind of joint, like a knee joint or a hip joint, this is going to be the epiphysis. Okay, so epiphysis at the top, at the bottom, same thing, same kind of epiphysis, right? So diaphysis is the shaft of the bone in the middle. Now, to be even more specific, the surface that's covered in cartilage. Okay, remember, another type of connective tissue that kind of softens the impact of movement and allows for reduced friction and ability for the joints to function normally. That area is called the articular surface on the bone, and it's covered by cartilage. Again, hyaline cartilage would be one that's found here. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage in the body, again, found in all common joints. Again, like the knees, hips, others, right, that we all know about. And so again, the reticular surface just refers to that surface of the bone where the cartilage would be basically placed. And then imagine if you go deeper into the bone where the spongy bone is. So in a living bone, those spaces would not be filled with air. but would be filled with actually the material, which is bone marrow. There's two types of bone marrow, yellow bone marrow and red bone marrow. Most bones will have both of these, and sort of in different combination, different quantities, depending actually on age, depending on different kind of situations. But essentially, the bigger the larger the bone marrow would be, just kind of logically, this makes sense. So like the pelvis, the femur would have very significant supplies of bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is just basically adipose tissue or fat. Just the same kind of fat we have in other places in the body. They're storing lipids, storing fat molecules. So we have it inside the bones as well. And the much more important component is the red bone marrow, which is actually the source of all red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets in the body. When we're going to talk about blood in more details in the blood chapter, we'll get into this a lot more, but essentially for now, red bone marrow, when you see that under microscope on slides, this is the source of all red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets in the body. It's a very, very important, critical component for survival, obviously, right? We need, remember, blood to carry oxygen, to carry the nutrients. So these cells that will go to the blood are actually originate here in the bone marrow. Now, so some of the other components here, just to kind of add additional details. Again, make sure you're looking in the book, make sure you're following, right? You'll have images to see, histology images and gross anatomy images in the book. When we're thinking of periosteum, again, periosteum is something that potentially needs to be connected to the bone, right? Something that can kind of slide off it. We don't want it sliding, right? We need it connected, right? So we have something called Sharpie's fibers that actually anchor the periosteum, these fibers, to the cortical bone itself. And when you're thinking about the bone itself and saying, looking at it under a microscope or kind of seeing it in images, there's some chemistry to the bone, like I mentioned before. Best way to characterize bone chemistry is to say there's organic and inorganic chemical components to the bone. The organic component is the one that we're producing, right? Organic means living, that the person has produced or the living organism has produced. And these are the collagen fibers that we find in the bone, right? There are many different types of collagen, but typical common type of collagen is found in the bones. That's a very, very important component. Just like we have collagen in our skin and in other organs, these are long strands of protein fibers that add stability and strength to the organ. Again, that's the organic chemical component, and the inorganic is the one that essentially, basically calcium. Now, calcium could be found in different forms in the body. When it travels in the blood and other areas, could be as an electrolyte, so calcium 2+, remember, charged molecule. But when it's stored in the bone, it doesn't need to be an electrolyte, and it more successfully needs to be stored as what's called calcium hydroxyapatite. That's the more normal chemical formation of calcium. Again, that's the inorganic chemical component in the bones, right? And both calcium and collagen combine together to provide the tensile strength and the stability and rigidity to the bone that essential for the normal skeleton to function. When we think of actual bone cells, remember we said osteocyte bones that live in these lacunae. So now, even though you might necessarily individually see the osteocytes, but we know that they come in two different forms. One is the cell that builds the bone, that actually generates, synthesizes bone by taking all these components, collagen, calcium together. And so these cells are called osteoblasts. And osteoblasts, again, the cells that are very important, active throughout your whole life, building the skeleton, and especially very active, keep in mind, during growth, during childhood, when you're growing, your skeleton is getting bigger, and so osteoblasts are very, very active. But at the same time, we need to have a balance in life and in the skeletal system as well, so there has to be some bone cells that actually remove some of the bone, right? So we can't just continuously be making bone. We have to sometimes be able to remove some of the bone when necessary. Think of bone fractures, think of damage to the bone, some other normal processes. So we need to have another cell that does that. The cell that can enzymatically remove bone or use enzymes to digest the bone, remove calcium, remove other components. These are called osteoclasts. It's a very different types of cell, but they both live inside the bones. Again, osteoblast will be building up the bone or synthesizing the bone material, and osteoclast will be destroying the bone or removing it. Right? So if you think about how can we remove part of the bone somewhere, right? Regular cells cannot do that. Remember, right? Bone is a very unique structure, very unique kind of chemical composition. The only type of cell that can remove bone, can do that, can extract calcium out of it, are these osteoclasts. Okay, so again, keep in mind, review this chapter in the book, look at the pictures, and then for the next two chapters will be naming the bones, looking at diagrams and pictures of the skeleton to learn more about osteology.